All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. We're really excited today to be talking with Jay Myers at NGen Canada, just to give an interview and an overview about the state of climate reporting in manufacturing in Canada. So we'll just kick it off with some introductions around the room, and then we'll leave it to Jay and Sanders to kind of take the stage. So yeah, Sanders, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Sanders Lazier. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Carbonhound. So, what we do is try to make it simple to deal with the 2,500 different pieces of legislation that have been passed worldwide in climate, and make it easy to be able to respond and be proactive in terms of dealing with those incoming requirements. So, we'll talk more about that later, but really, it's just about how do we demystify it and simplify it and make it so that you can turn it into advantage for your business.
Yeah, Jay, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren and Sanders. Really great to be here. I'm Jay Myers. I'm the CEO of Next Generation Manufacturing Canada, or NGen for short. We're a not-for-profit organization that is focusing on building world-leading advanced manufacturing capabilities in Canada, and as a part of that, really focusing on many of the strategic challenges, but also the strategic opportunities facing Canadian industry. Where we're focusing on advanced manufacturing, which means not only manufacturing in terms of producing things, but manufacturing that is using technology, the latest techniques, the latest technologies, really to improve their business, to build competitive advantage here in Canada, and to grow their business around the world. And NGen does that in a couple of ways. We support leading edge collaborative projects that help to transform industrial capabilities in Canada. But we also draw attention to some of the strategic opportunities that the Canadian industry has today, and clearly climate and sustainability and overall social governance is a huge opportunity, but also a huge challenge for many companies. So that's why I'm really glad to be here and to be working closely with Carbonhound.
Amazing. Yeah, I think we'll would love to just hear from your side if you could just share a bit more about why this is important to you and sort of what you're hearing in the space. And then after Sanders, we'll pass over to Sanders to give an overview of sort of the climate landscape, GHG 101s. But yeah, starting kind of with what your perspective is.
No, great. And climate and climate change poses clearly an existential challenge for not only for the world's population, but for businesses around the world as well, and particularly as governments, as customers, as stakeholders are requiring businesses to report their carbon emissions, and then to go further than just simply reporting, but to have processes in place that lead to reductions in carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions generally, and then of course improvements in their ability to operate environmentally sustainable businesses. So it's a major challenge. We recognize that, and it's a major opportunity as well for many companies. But let me talk first of all about some of the imminent challenges here for Canadian manufacturers and Canadian industry. Clearly, if the Canadian government, as part of United Nations and governments around the world, are taking much more active steps to ensure that economies meet their emission reduction targets or net zero targets over the next 25 years or so. And that begins with simply measuring emissions. If you don't measure something, it's very hard to improve. We all know that. And that's why I think it's really important for all Canadian businesses to take this very seriously. As I say, it's an opportunity for process improvement, particularly around energy management. But there are many other really pressing reasons why Canadian companies have to take this very seriously. One of them is, of course, that the countries around the world are looking at requiring companies to report emissions, requiring companies to show how they are reducing emissions. And as a result of that, now we have, with the European Union in particular, um, plans in place to put tariffs onto export or imports from other countries based on carbon emissions, and that's something that will be followed by other countries as well. The United States is looking very keenly at a similar type of trade regime. So if we want to make sure that our exports are acceptable in international markets, particularly now in Europe, the UK is following suit, but also within very short period of time in the United States, then we need to be able to make sure that our exports have a carbon passport, that we know exactly what the carbon content of those exports are. And that is particularly important, of course, for the manufacturing sector that accounts for close to 80% of Canada's exports here. So it's a business problem if we want access to our export markets, and that's only going to become a much more stringent requirement going forward. Today in Europe, it will be applying to a very small group of or small sector of companies, including steel and fertilizer, aluminum, chemicals. But that swath of companies will grow over a period of time, and the requirement for reporting on exports is at the beginning of 2026. So we need to all exporters need to be aware of that and taking steps to be able to comply with these requirements, or pay a much heavier duty for accessing these markets. But the second reason that we are very keen and very interested in this whole area are the requirements that are being put in place and that will be effective at the beginning of this coming year by financial institutions in Canada. In the 2022 federal budget, the federal government flagged that it was going to be requiring all federal financial institutions, federally regulated financial institutions, to report their Scope 1 and Scope 2, as well as Scope 3 carbon emissions. I'll leave it up to Sanders to explain what each of those what that actually means. But what it effectively means is that federally regulated banks and most insurers in Canada will be requiring their customers, especially their industrial customers, their manufacturing customers, to begin to report their own emissions as resulting from their processes, as well as the indirect emissions that come from their energy requirements. I think financial institutions will not be requiring immediately them to report Scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions from their supply chain. However, that is probably something that is going to be required very shortly here. So what that really means is that in order to obtain financial support, financing from banks, in order to register on stock exchanges in the United States, for example, in order to obtain insurance or to ensure that insurance premiums are relatively low, all Canadian manufacturers are going to have to begin to report their emissions. And that's where we really want to make sure that we are arming Canadian manufacturers, Canadian technology companies, all Canadian exporters with the tools that they require to make sure that they are compliant with these financial requirements and with the trade requirements that are going to be put in place by both Europe and very shortly by the United States. And that's, as I say, why we're very interested in working with Carbonhound, make sure that we are We have solutions in place that we can offer to companies. These are imminent challenges, and they're very important challenges. Government could regulate all at once in terms of requiring companies to report emissions, and any company in Canada that reports over 10,000 or that has over 10,000 tons of carbon equivalent in terms of emissions already needs to that those companies already need to report. But what the financial institutions are doing is much broader than that. It's going to require every manufacturer, every industrial customer, every business who is a client, the insurance companies or the banks, to report their emissions. So let's be ahead of the game here, and also recognizing, of course, that emission reporting is extremely important for business. As I said before, being able to report emissions, being able to measure emissions is a good first step in actually understanding energy requirements and energy management and process improvement here. So in the end, it actually will lead to lower cost on the part of those companies that can take that information and improve processes as a result of that. So for all of those reasons, we're extremely interested in working with Carbonhound, providing solutions here. It's the international insurance business, as a result of climate-related events, is losing billions and billions of dollars a year. This isn't just a Canadian issue; it's a global issue, and it's being driven largely on the part of reinsurers across around the world because of the losses that they're realizing. So they're taking action to ensure that companies are themselves taking action to reduce emissions, and we need to recognize that. At the end of the day, it's going to simply be an issue of whether or not companies are going to be able to secure property insurance or secure property insurance at reasonable rates here, or secure financing, or list on stock exchanges, or be able to raise venture capital. All of that is at risk if technology companies, if manufacturers, if any industrial client is not able to report emissions as a first step, and then go further to improve processes and reduce emissions. So as again, for all of those reasons, we're extremely we're concerned. I don't think a majority of companies in Canada are aware of what they're facing here. I am confident that we'll be able to help the financial industry and help the insurance industry in particular to develop the types of emission reporting systems that they will require. But they have to be simple, as particularly for small business, and they have to guarantee the quality of the data that is being used here. So thanks to Carbonhound, not only for this podcast, but also for the tremendous work that you're doing in order to provide industrial clients with a tool that does the work for them, that reports, that guarantees quality, and that is acceptable to financial institutions and hopefully to governments around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for all of those reasons that you listed and then some, there's so much pressure on manufacturers to know and to kind of keep the ear on the ground and to kind of manage their climate reporting, but a lot of them really have no idea where to start, and rightfully and reasonably so. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of different standards. Um, and part of what we're aiming to do is to simplify that for folks. So, I'll pass it over to Sanders to give a little overview of where people can start. Kind of the 101, the kind of get started, how to, and then following that, we'll open it up for a discussion between you and Sanders, and then take some questions from our viewers. So, Sanders, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Yeah, I think just to add some color to Jay's comments there, because obviously I'm running a carbon accounting company, so I'm kind of a data guy at heart. So we were running some numbers, for example, like if you're exporting aluminum or aluminium, as they would say in Europe, over to the EU, the expected carbon tariffs on that could be up to 45% on those goods that you're sending over there, right? So like these are not insignificant impacts that will occur, and it will impact the competitiveness of your products. And so when we're talking to a lot of clients, it's not just about, okay, we've got to count our carbon, what a pain, right? It's about, okay, how are you positioning yourselves? How are you thinking about competitiveness in that market? And how is that going to shift? And what are the opportunities that are going to arise from, inevitably, whenever there's a change in regulation or there's some big shift in the market in terms of what the needs are, that creates a huge amount of opportunity. So how can we empower customers to get after that opportunity? And, Jay's point about the insurance side is, just to put a point on it, it's estimated that this is about an $18 trillion risk, right? So for context, that's 18 times bigger than the financial crisis, right? So the impact that climate is having on, from a risk perspective is massive. And, we only need to look at the news to get an understanding of why that's the case. And it's no wonder that all of the major newspapers around the world have created entire staffs of reporters just focusing on climate. Like it's a huge, huge problem and growing. So all that rosy, all that rosy outlook aside, let me just walk you through some of what we like to call kind of climate reporting 101. So if you wouldn't mind popping up, thank you very much, Lauren. Um, so really what we want to focus on today is just what are the basics, because you're going to start getting, we've got clients who, significant portions of their revenue were, requesting and requiring this kind of data. So we just want to go through a little bit more about that, give you a little bit of context, and start off with the extreme basics. So Jay's kind of mentioned it, but 60,000 of the world's largest companies face regulation requiring supply chain emissions reporting by 2026. So, but it's really hard to respond with integrity to these requests for all the reasons that we've kind of outlined already, which is, there's a whole science around how you calculate your carbon emissions, and it's a whole vocation, right? So expecting just to be able to pick that up immediately and be able to do it yourself, it's challenging. And do you trust it enough that if your clients are being regulated on this, that you trust the data that's being outputted? Well, for a lot of companies, it's no, right? But as a result of those 60,000 businesses that are being regulated, that means that the more than 4 million businesses worldwide, we estimate, are going to be impacted by climate reporting. So when we think about climate reporting, like how does it fit in, right? We hear a lot about climate, we hear a lot about sustainability, we hear a lot about ESG, we hear a lot about woke capitalism, we hear a lot about ESG backlash. There's all this news and kind of connotations that are charged around some of these words. So let's just kind of dig into it a little bit. So obviously ESG is kind of the largest bubble. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. So the G in governance was always the one that people focused on most, I'd say, when this first got introduced, but really is trying to capture all of the non-financial factors that impact a business, right? Then we get into sustainability. So sustainability is kind of broader. When we think about sustainability, it's not just counting the calculating your carbon emissions. It's also your impact from a waste and pollution perspective. So it's a much broader scope that we're thinking about here. So it's not just about the CO2, because there's a whole lot else going on site, as well as you well know. So all of the kind of environmental aspects, all of that kind of fits into sustainability. There's also sustainable business models, thinking about end of life use, thinking about different ways of thinking about how we reduce the amount of waste that manufacturing, for instance, produces, and create systems to help reduce that. So that's all part of sustainability. Often when you think about it from an Indigenous perspective, I think it's 3 or 5 generations that they think about in the future, and thinking about how you can create something that will last over hundreds of years. But when we talk about climate, we measure climate impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So what's really interesting is that when you look at this entire puzzle, the nice thing about the climate piece is that it's quantified, right? There's methodologies, it's science backed, there's very specific ways that you calculate it. So it's a little bit more akin to classical accounting than it is to kind of other kind of ESG initiatives, which might be harder to quantify the impact of. So climate, it's a little bit simpler. So that's why we focus on it, because it's, there's less opinion and more kind of science-based approaches that are taken to quantify climate impact. And all of that is measured in what's called greenhouse gas emissions. So not all emissions that come from your smokestack are going to be greenhouse gases, right? So the reason for that is only certain gases will actually trap heat in the atmosphere, and so those are the ones that we're really worried about, because those are the ones that are driving global warming. Okay, so how are GHG or greenhouse gas emissions measured? Well, look, it's actually really simple, grade school math. It's really just multiplication, but it can get complicated in a few different ways. But let's start with the basics. So basically, the way that you calculate your emissions is you'll take your what's called usage data. So this is let's say the number of liters of fuel that you burned, and then you multiply that by what's called an emission factor. And an emission factor is basically, it's based on a bunch of different scientifically backed journals that have done analysis and figured out that for every 1 liter of, let's say, diesel that you burn, it will emit this many kilograms of CO2, this many kilograms of NO2, this many kilograms of methane, right? So they've done the math, they've done the assessment of it, and so the EPA, DEFRA, like there's a bunch of government, NRCan in Canada, all of them produce what are called emission factors. So for example, there's an emission factor for electricity grid in Ontario because it's quite different based on the energy generation. So we've got a lot more hydro here and in Quebec compared to, let's say, Manitoba, where there's a lot more diesel. So emission factors can change based on the region that you're in. They can also change on the particular process that you're measuring, right? So basically that emission factor translates that operational data that you have into greenhouse gas data. But it can often be hard to get that information. So I might know that I'm ordering 100 tons of steel from a manufacturer, but I don't know what the carbon intensity is of that steel, right? Like how much energy and how much carbon was required to make that steel. And so that's where things get tricky, and that's when you start to think about, okay, how can we estimate things? Can we ask suppliers for their data? If we ask suppliers for their data, are they going to give it to us? So there's a lot of factors there, and that's when you start getting into what's called spend-based estimates. So if all else fails and all you have is your accounting book, you can still get a rough understanding of what your emissions are based on what's called spend-based estimates. So this is where you look at the dollar value, and that you can apply an emission factor to that. Now, it's extremely inaccurate, but it is a good place to get started, because at the end of the day, the most important thing is that you just get going. And then from there, you might start to, change the processes of what you're asking from your clients, or you might realize that there's other data in those, receipts that you haven't been tracking, maybe the weight of the material that you're capturing, that you can then use to apply better kind of what's called proxy data. So, okay, well, you're giving us 10 tons of fruit. Okay, cool. We can find an emission factor per pound of fruit based on the type of fruit that you have. Is it going to be perfect? No, but will be much better than a spend-based emission estimate. So then the best, obviously, is if you can go to your suppliers and say, hey, can you tell me how much, what your greenhouse gas emissions are per ton of fruit that we're buying from you? And so that's called like supplier provided data, and that's the best. So when you think about a lot of your customers, they're getting to the point where they've probably been doing spend-based emission factors before, and then these large corporates are kind of moving up to estimates, and now they're at the point where they're being required to talk to their supply chain and get an understanding of what their emissions are, because they need to upgrade their data to that supplier provided data set. And so that's really what they're trying to do when they're talking to you. And so that's why it gets quite important to them, because we've, like, for some of our customers, moving up in quality has often, in many times, reduced massively the impact that the measurements. So we had one case, it was tens of thousands of tons that were reduced as a result of moving from spend-based all the way up to supplier provided. So it's really important, especially when you look at, let's say, the Walmarts of the world, or you look at other large corporates who are trying to decarbonize, like 3M is another example. in order to be able to reward their suppliers for decarbonizing, they need real transparent data they can trust, right? So, it's really critical that they're getting that supplier provided data, because if they start giving you all sorts of benefits like improved, supplier financing, like that trade financing, that kind of thing, then and they find out that actually as everything was based on estimates and the data was garbage, then they're opening themselves up to greenwashing accusations as well. So now that we know now we know we take that use of that operational data, let's say liters of fuel, and we multiply that by this emission factor, and we get our emissions, right? So then you might hear Jay kind of mention scope, right? So scope's really important, and basically what scope is just trying to help companies organize all of these emissions into different categories. So scope 1 is direct emissions from sources of emissions that are owned by that company. So let's say you've got a boiler or some sort of process running on site that uses, a fuel, right? So that would be combusted on site. You've got control over that asset. That is scope 1. Or it could be maybe you have a fleet of vehicles. You own those vehicles, so you have control over them. You can choose whether you have electric or gas vehicles if you wish. Regardless, because you own them, they're scope 1. So it's basically, think about it like within the 4 walls of the operations of your business, that's really scope 1. Scope 2 is called purchased energy, and for the most part, just to keep it simple, it's anything you're plugging into the grid for. So the reason for that is, whilst you have control over how much energy you're using, you don't control the grid that you're on, right? In terms of the region, like you don't control whether Ontario produces nuclear or natural gas in terms of its energy mix. So that's scope 2. Sometimes you get imported steam if you're downtown. Enwave's a good example of that. And then scope 3 is literally everything else. So that's why scope 3 gets so complicated, because especially when you look at supply chains, it can get really, really really messy, because effectively it's any dollar that you're spending as a business has some sort of climate impact, right? So, how do we get our arms around that? And so what we typically would do, and I'll walk through this later, is we have a process to help you figure out what you need to measure and what you don't need to measure. But basically, when people are talking about scope 1 and 2, it's easy. You just think about it as, okay, what are the things that are creating emissions on our site? What are we combusting on site? What are we combusting in vehicles that we own? What are we plugging into the wall? Scope 3, everything else, and we'll kind of get into that. And, as you can tell, it's a huge proportion of emissions. So the reason why you're seeing a lot of governments kind of force these large businesses to think about their scope 3 emissions is because it makes up a massive proportion of the impact that these companies have, right? And as you well know, if you're trying to create change, overall to hit these Paris Climate Accord numbers, then you really need to tackle scope 3 with these large corporates, because that's where the vast majority of their emissions are coming from. And you can influence trillions of dollars of spend at these organizations if you incentivize it correctly, right? So that's why you're seeing, all these regulators go after scope 3, because they basically say, okay, well, we don't really want to regulate everybody, so we're going to regulate these big guys and then force them to move their scope 3 down, because that's how we're going to kind of get percolation into the rest of the ecosystem and drive those numbers that we need to. It's also obviously outside of your control. It could include, let's say, upstream, downstream transportation. So how do you get your goods on site? What are the goods that you're purchasing? That's another big one as well. So if you're purchasing steel, that's obviously a very high carbon product. So, you have to understand what the impact of that is. And so it's really important to understand what your scope 3 emissions are, because that can also create risk as well. Like you might have situations where those regions are being increasingly, pressured as it relates to climate regulations. And so maybe their prices will go up, right? So you just there are impacts on your business that you have to think about when thinking about the cost of carbon being applied in more and more contexts around the world. Okay, and so how does this actually roll down to an individual manufacturer, right? So your scope 1 and 2 is their scope 3, right? So that's the way to think about it. And when these large companies are trying to figure out, or when any of these regulated companies are trying to figure out what they're going to do, they're often multi-jurisdictional, so they have locations in multiple places, which means they might be impacted by multiple different regulations. And so what we've found is that a lot of businesses, when they're asking for this data from their supplier, there's a whole suite of different standards that they're using and that they're asking and formats they're asking for this data within, right? So whether it's ISO, CDP, CSRD, this is a lot of three-letter acronyms, but basically some of these are, regulations like CBAM is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So, if you're exporting any metal to the EU that's worth more than $150 in total, like it's wild. Even if it's the spring in a toy car, right, and it adds up to more than $150, you are going to get regulated. Anyone who's buying that, all of your importers are going to have to disclose that, and you're going to be forced to disclose how much metal you're importing into the EU. So these regulations really are reaching across boundaries, and so they can create risks for you as you think about kind of continuing to scale and grow your business outside of Canada, especially. Europe in particular, and looking at California are kind of two of the jurisdictions that this is really particularly pertinent for. But basically, you'll probably get asked to do any one of these here. If that's the case, then you're falling into that bucket of needing to disclose your emissions. And they might ask for other things too. It might not just be your emissions, might be looking at adherence to anti-slavery acts, that kind of thing. So there are other pieces to the puzzle that you're often being asked for. And so, you look at one of our clients, Bobo's, like they were really struggling because they had large customers that were at risk. They didn't used to get the client requests. Now they're getting them all the time. And it was increasingly expensive for them to respond to these requests. Like I've had customers where they're literally just laughed out of the room because they were a smaller business and they needed support on this for a large customer who was requiring it as part of the procurement process. And they just said, yeah, do you have $100,000+ because we're busy. So if you're not spending that much, then we don't really want to talk to you. And then doing it yourself can be really challenging. It can be error prone. It doesn't have the stamp of approval from a third party. So, you have to convince, how do you convince your stakeholders that that's actually, a number that they can trust? And then it can be incredibly manual, 5+ hours a week in some cases, depending on the data that you have to maintain it. So for many companies, it's not really a sustainable solution, and it can be really challenging to do all of this. Especially when you've got changing requests and changing requirements from your customers. So Bobo's, then basically we worked with them. They're a food manufacturer out of Colorado, and they have distribution across the US. And we worked with them to set their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions to get ahead of the customer and regulatory requirements. And as a result, they were what we call climate confident in 2 months. They were able to respond to those requests from their customers. They were able to automate a massive, I think maybe all of their data that they needed to automate in order to facilitate those reports. So we helped them automate those processes. And now they're able to confidently and repeatedly kind of respond to any of those requests that they're getting from their customers to be able to kind of prove their quote unquote climate bona fides. And I think when we look at the broader kind of picture around sustainability, and you hear a lot about these greenwashing accusations that are coming in, sorry, not even accusations, but legislation that's come into place, whether it's C-59 in Canada, or there's kind of greenwashing regulations in the EU and in the UK, as well as in California. They reach across borders, right? And some of them will fine you up to like a minimum of 4% of your international turnover. All right, so international revenue. So not your profits, your revenue. And so the reason why I mention this is because it's becoming increasingly important, and Canada's regulations here too, to be able to back your claims. And so we really need to think about it from a quantified perspective and make sure that we're measuring everything so that we make these claims to our suppliers, to our customers, that we're able to back that up with data, and make sure that we're reducing the risk from those kind of greenwashing accusations that now have teeth behind them with the Competition Act. Okay, so in general, here's how we do it. We try to keep it as simple as possible. You can take this process for yourself. You don't have to use Carbonhound to do this. This is just how we run it. Happy to share it. And basically, it's a four-step process. First is we kick it off. We identify all the emission sources, the different, like where the data is located, and look at where we need to make estimates versus where we have real data that we can use. Um, Obviously go through priorities, make sure that you're just doing the reporting that you need based on what your clients or stakeholders are asking for, right? Then you have to go out and find the data, and that's when you start to figure out, okay, what's my checklist? Where are all the data sources that I need to connect in order to get this report and make sure it's complete? And then after that, it's about actually taking that data and converting it, getting it quantified, and using appropriate emission factors, making sure that you've covered, you don't have any data gaps, and that you've got a full inventory report that you feel confident in. After that, obviously you can kind of iterate on it year over year. You might find that you don't have data in certain areas. That's totally okay, and you have to use estimates. Maybe you need to maybe you change what you're asking for from some of your suppliers to increase that, or maybe you've got the data already. It's just not in a place or in a format. Maybe it's sitting on a piece of paper somewhere that you can use. So maybe it's changing how you manage the data internally from an operational perspective as well, and putting those systems in place to support that. So, it's an ongoing process. It's not something that you need to get perfect from day one. I think everybody understands that. And so it's the most important thing is just getting started and making sure that you're leveraging the data that you have as much as possible, so that you can ensure that you're meeting your stakeholder requirements. Specifically, we found 80% of their customers are demanding it from them. So that's a significant driver that we're seeing. I like to call it the voluntold market, is my way of describing it. But hopefully this has kind of been helpful, just to give you a high level understanding of, when people talk about scopes, what do they mean? When they talk about emission factors, what do they mean? When we think about, okay, how do we actually get started? What are the different steps that we need to do? The goal here is just to give you a very high level overview. There's also more content on our blog and our website if you want. It's all free, it's all out there. And if you're looking for some help, then obviously we're happy to help as well. So I think that's it for me on that topic. I'll pass it over to Lauren to get into the Q&A.
Awesome. Yeah, Jay, just if there's any sort of comments or questions that came out of that from you, feel free. And then, otherwise I can jump in with some questions from our side and from the viewers.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Sanders. I think it was a really great overview of the process and the importance of being able to report on emissions. I have two things. One is again not to kind of ignite much more of a burning platform here, because I think there is, if we're talking about access to markets, if we're talking about ability to obtain financing or insurance, this is clearly something that all companies have to take seriously. But going back to the data quality issue, too, this is something that could lead to real litigation. So it is a legal problem, and it's also something where, in a number of cases, where boards of directors have been found personally responsible, personally liable for maintaining the quality of the data that is being reported here. So this is already becoming a major issue for not, and I think your example is a good one for many smaller suppliers in supply chains right around the world. But the other thing I wanted to say is we've talked about the burning platforms, but let's talk about the opportunities here too. And Canada has a fantastic opportunity, or Canadian companies, to take advantage of the low carbon energy sources that we have, are the work that has already been done in Canada by many companies to improve energy management here. And if we can show the impact of that, if we can actually report this, I think Canadian companies are in a terrific position to take advantage of that as well. So it's not just a burning platform; it's a strategic business opportunity for many companies too.
And just to build on that, Jay, I think that's why you're seeing a lot of EV manufacturers setting up shop and battery manufacturers setting up shop in Ontario, right? Because of and in Quebec, because of how cheap, from a carbon perspective, a lot of the fuel is. And so that's a huge driver for growth in the region too. So there's a strategic reason for the province to push that as well. Um, and you're right. I think that's why, when we look at like, there's this one company I did a webinar with called Nouveau Monde Graphite, really interesting business. So they're based just north of Montreal, and they were in a commoditized space where graphite was dominated by China, right? And they said to themselves, okay, well, we can't compete on price, so we're going to partner with Caterpillar and with these other large suppliers, and we're going to create the first like gas-free mine, basically. And what they did was they ended up taking that and signing deals with Panasonic and other large OEMs, because despite it being more expensive, these OEMs are putting value not just on the quality and the price, but now the environmental components of that product are being valued as part of those procurement chains. And you're seeing trillions of dollars worldwide in terms of government spending. Like, there's increasing green procurement processes and government spend. So, and obviously private companies as well who are feeling that pressure, like we just explained, like Panasonic, for instance. So I think it's really and under getting the data to be able to compare and say, how do we compare? How do we benchmark against our peers, right? I think it's definitely an opportunity to look at that benchmark and say to ourselves, okay, maybe we're doing a lot better than we think. Even if we don't change anything today, we might actually be much lower from a carbon intensity perspective than we think compared to our peers. And maybe that's a big opportunity for us.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to ask you though. We talked a little bit about the financial regulations here, and I know that you and Carbonhound have been doing a lot of work with the Office of Superintendent for Financial Institutions here in Canada, but also other financial regulators. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening there and what you expect, what's coming down the pipe?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, we've just been in contact with them to, we build solutions for financial institutions as well, and so we wanted to make sure we're on the right side of that when we're building it to meet OFC's requirements. And so what we found is that they're taking what's called they have to meet what's called PCAF, and part of PCAF is an international standard around financed emissions. And the big focus there is that they're really worried about climate risk and how it's going to impact the underlying loans that these banks are making, right? So they're really worried, is there going to be stranded assets, for example, in high carbon, I don't know, gas extraction, for example, maybe in the tar sands, right? Because what you're going to see is that large businesses, and they've already started to do that, so even I think TC Energy just spun out a solids and like a liquids division recently. People are starting to spin out these carbon intensive assets into other businesses because investors are less and less excited about investing in those areas, right? And so that's, and I think if you look internationally, I think the OPEC just downgraded their estimates on fuel usage growth internationally as well. So I think what we're starting to see is that with the huge amount of renewables that are coming into the system, there's more and more, carbon intense processes are going to be increasingly under pressure, under competitive pressure. And so banks are going to want to take a look at that. And then, not to mention, obviously, the physical risk element of climate change and what it's going to have on those facilities. Like, you look in Ohio, for instance, they're spending tens of millions of dollars installing, HVAC and air conditioning units because the workers can't work in the factories during the summer anymore because it's too hot. So there's material risks that they believe and that the markets believe that need to be taken into account. And so that's the real driver behind it. It's not some mission that they're on to solve climate change. It's actually really about, being pragmatic about the fact that there are impacts that climate change is having on business operations, and those need to be reflected in the lending behaviors and the risk analysis that these banks are doing.
Well, and you were mentioning about the the losses that the global insurance industry has encountered here, and I can guarantee that's probably only a third of the loss or the total loss as a result of climate-related events. But from the insurance companies, there is a limited pool of money here as well. So when we're talking about insurance companies requiring their clients to report emissions, and if their clients cannot or do not do that, this really isn't as much an issue about your premiums will go up. It's just an issue about whether or not you're going to be able to get insurance.
For sure. Just look at Florida, right? I think that you want to see the future, go down to Florida and look at the insurance market there.
You were talking and switching a little bit here, but you mentioned or talked a lot about data quality, and how did just a real kind of technical question around how does Carbonhound handle that issue? What sort of protections or what sort of processes do you have in place to be able to manage that issue?
Yeah, so data quality is pretty critical. As I mentioned, it has a huge impact on the accuracy of your footprint. So when we talk about footprint or inventory, basically what that means is like an inventory report is the sum total that of all the emissions of your business, kind of put into a nice format that is easy to understand. So when we talk about data quality, what we do at Carbonhound at least is every single piece of data that enters into our platform gets tagged with how it was entered and what kind of methodology it was used. And so as a result, like we've got a solution that we've created in order to help facilitate data collection because we've seen it be such a barrier for so many companies. And so as a result, what we do is we directly integrate with the primary data sources, like whether it's utility providers or maybe your ERP, whatever the source of truth is, and we pull that data directly into the platform, and then we have our team also QA it and make sure that's accurate before it gets kind of put into the system, and we also make sure that the appropriate emission factor is also applied to that data as well. So there's kind of like a multi-step process that we go through to make sure that the data is accurate, and also looking at how we can reduce the amount of effort that it takes to get these high integrity reports. So the theory was, let's reduce the effort, and then hopefully customers will value their time savings and also value the fact that it's a higher quality, higher integrity report that they're receiving.
And that was going into my my last question for you directly, Sanders, and that's when we're talking about industrial clients in or suppliers in Canada, probably over 95% of them are small, medium-sized companies or really small companies here. Companies without necessarily the expertise or the time or the personnel that for managing a complicated system. But what you're doing is automating as much of this as you possibly can, doing the checks on data quality in an automated way. Tell us a little bit about how complicated this system is, and or on the flip side, how easy it would be for a smaller company to actually be able to work with the system to report their emissions.
Yeah, so I mean, look, we're not the only game in town, but in terms of, we try to keep our prices low as possible. So for a small business under 20 employees, you're looking at like $600 a year for the platform fees. And if you want guided onboarding, which is, I don't think we've worked with clients for a year now without making sure that they purchase that, it's something like, it's around $1,500 or so. So it's not a huge capital expenditure. The goal is to make it as simple as possible, make it accessible. Like, the reason I started this business was because I felt like there's a lack of solutions out there that were affordable and also designed for folks who don't have a degree in sustainability, right? Because at the end of the day, if you don't understand your own data, then it's going to be really hard for you to feel confidence around making those claims from a marketing perspective. So from our perspective, it's really about empowerment. Like, how do we get you up and running? How do we help you how do we like help educate you and look at your business in a different way than using the same data, but just looking at it in a different way than you've seen it before. And hopefully, what we've found is that it helps businesses get a better understanding of their operations than they may have had before, just because it's a different way of looking at it. But it doesn't need to be difficult. There's online calculators and stuff. Like if you really are just looking to, the EPA has one. I think Berkeley has a pretty good one on their website. So if you're just looking to do a quick and dirty and just kind of dip your toe in the water a little bit, like there's definitely resources out there. But if you're looking for something where you see this as something that your customers are requiring and that it's more important to your business operations, then it's quite important that you have systems in place that are really consistent, because you're going to be asked how you're doing over time, right? And so having that consistency and using the exact same methodologies and data sources, and having that consistency over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 years is going to be pretty critical in terms of the integrity of the claims that you're making. And what we found is that in businesses where there's no sustainability staff, they don't want to spend 80, 100 grand hiring somebody. That project often is off the side of someone's desk, and it's the guy who bikes into work who ends up doing it. And that person might change next year and the year after and the year after that. So all of a sudden now you've got a really big problem around consistency in terms of the processes and how you're going about that. And so having a system in place that can kind of hold that truth is really important, because it means that it reduces all of the other risks that are associated with this kind of reporting. So whether you choose us or someone else, I think just having some sort of system in place is really important. And if you can layer on data automation, that removes another huge area where you can get inconsistencies around the accuracy of what you're doing too. So it's really, for us, just about like, how do we take away all of those risks and make it really simple for people to move forward.
No, good stuff. Lauren, I know we've got a lot of questions here so I'll pass it back to you.
For sure. I'm just going to pop one up on the screen here. And so, either of you can kind of speak to this probably, but the question is around what advice you might have for any government policy or programming that would help manufacturing companies kind of adopt these best practices, and yeah, what that looks like.
Maybe, do you want to do that first, Sanders?
Let me think about the question here. So one thing that's quite interesting, what advice should government policy program to help all advancement? So I'm trying to figure out what perspective this is coming from. But one of the areas where I think is really helpful to start to focus in on is energy management, especially for manufacturers. And I do know that there's programs through the ISO, for example, and sometimes through your local district providers from an energy perspective, like the Enbridges of the world, where you can get hooked up and get free training on energy management through a government program. And then there's also, I think they just announced this last week, up to $50,000 of matching funds for businesses that want to hire an energy manager starting in January. So that's a really good way to start to think about how you can reduce your costs and reduce your emissions, and to take some actual action around reducing the operational footprint of your business. There's also there's some maybe some online resources, specifically the greenhouse gas protocol. That's really great in terms of just giving kind of an overview around the quantification side. But I think in terms of the government policy and programming to help advanced manufacturing companies adopt it, I think there's that's definitely something that I feel like Jay and the team is kind of working on. So I'll kind of pass it over to you for that piece.
Yeah, thanks. I guess a couple of things. First of all, education is so important here. Just understanding why this is an important issue, and really the opportunities around this. And I think that's and then being able to present this in a positive, constructive way, along with tools that are available for companies to manage. I think that's really important. A second thing is that the governments already have a number of programs in place to support the implementation of digital technologies and they primarily looked at things like e-commerce um, and IoT technologies and connectivity. But I think this is a really good example of a low cost solution where you need some advice and call on some consultants or call on some people who can provide that advice as well as some support for implementation. So, designing some form of a program to help to offset the costs of implementation. They're not going to be very large, and of course, you wouldn't want to offset total costs. Companies need to have uh, have some commitment here as well. But I think that's important too. But the other thing is, this is all a part of good corporate management, good manufacturing management for that part. It's all focusing on understanding processes, being able to measure process, being able to improve process. It fits in really nicely with best practices in manufacturing management, and why we don't look at things like actual environmental waste as waste in industrial management processes is beyond me. But I think there are all sorts of opportunities here that we need to build a much more effective um, manufacturing management education program, even in our school systems here. It's a huge area that companies really need to take into consideration much more. And this is simply part of how to do that effectively with respect to a source of environmental waste here. So I think there are lots of opportunities. It's an area where we're very, very interested in working with Carbonhound and other solution providers here, because at NGen we I think have a role to play in making sure that we're able to provide these tools, and the training, and bring attention to not only the issue but some of the solutions that are necessary too.
100%. Okay, what's her?
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, I'm conscious we have 2 more minutes, so I'll pull one more question up, and I just want to make a quick note for everybody asking if there'll be recording. Yes, this is being recorded. If you've registered for the event, we will send you the recording, so don't worry about that. And any questions that we don't get to here, we will try to address directly as part of that follow-up email. So yeah, definitely sign up if you want that. Okay, so just yeah, another kind of last question. This is a bit more of a technical question around how you would measure the emissions for finished products where the supply chain is complicated, basically. So yeah, maybe Sanders for you.
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways to do this. So obviously there's different emission factors based on region as well. So if you're able to get insights into where those raw materials were coming from and engage your suppliers, then obviously that's one way of doing it. But there's also life cycle analysis that you can do that are kind of basically studies that have been completed that are peer reviewed that you can use to estimate the impact of the emissions of those raw materials if you don't have access to the primary data sources. So that would be the sort of thing that during the onboarding process you would want to have an expert to kind of look at and find the relevant kind of source to figure out emissions.
Okay, amazing. Well, I think that's time on our live. Really appreciate everyone for joining us today. And yeah, look out for a follow-up email with the recording. And as always, feel free to reach out to anybody at NGen or Carbonhound as you embark on these climate journeys.
Right. Thanks very
Nice.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.